Hi everyone, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm joining you from the Bay Area. I'm Favianna, and I'm an artist, an activist, an environmentalist, and I work in the realm of culture, thinking about how do we change the imagination. I grew up in Oakland. I actually grew up in a very polluted community right next to the freeway. My two parents were immigrants, and so much about what I learned early on was that the images and the stories that we saw around us, whether it was on television or on billboards, shaped politics, right? That culture shaped politics, and that it really depended on who told the stories so that we could hear some different kinds of perspectives. And early on, I was an artist. I always loved to create work because I really love to express myself. I'm going to actually zip through some of these slides because I have a little bit less time than I thought. So what is culture? I want to first start with what is culture and why we need to leverage culture, especially around environmental issues. So culture is like a wave. It surrounds us all the time. It's like an ocean, and it is both, whether it's the flow in the ocean or the ground in the ocean, culture sets the stage for policy change. In fact, politics doesn't change until culture changes. Policy change is often the final manifestation of an idea whose time has come. But first, we have to help convince people, we have to help, especially young people, see why issues are important. And if we think about, even in our own country, why there is so much resistance, it's because the narratives around climate are simply not aligning. We have a whole field of climate deniers at the same time that we have people who are screaming, especially young people, that climate is something we need to pay attention to. So culture and the stories we tell around the environmental crisis are very important because it is these stories and concepts that really open up our imagination. When we think about culture, and we think about how people can express themselves, whether it's art, film, science, fashion, often these are representations of different kinds of values. And currently, we know that in order to address climate change and climate chaos, we need to do two things. We need to transition off of fossil fuels, and we need to change our global food system, because overwhelmingly, because of animal agriculture, we are creating a crisis. So if we look at even transforming the fossil fuel, our addiction to fossil fuel, what needs to happen? Clean energy, renewable energy. How do we get there when so much of the culture around us is actually promoting ideas about oil? For example, when you go watch movies, do you see solar panels? Do you see solar panels in superhero movies? You don't. You actually see people driving their cars. The cars is such a symbol of personal success, and cars are such a central figure in our narrative landscape that we are actually not seeing solutions. Right? And so we're not imagining solutions, and we're not going to transition off of a dirty energy economy until we can put forth solutions that sort of pave the way and help people imagine what change can look like. And we have to be doing that, especially in the classroom with young people, because often the narratives around climate are very much about doom and gloom, and yet what's needed is a sort of realignment to nature and a realignment with our understanding that we are an interconnected species, that we are interconnected to all of us at the global level, and that the impacts that happen here actually have reverberations around the world. And one of the key ways to do that is through culture, and I'm going to show you some examples. So as I talked to you earlier, what we are able to do in the realm of culture, in the realm of the imagination, can have impacts in the political sector and in the economic sector, but also the power of storytelling. If we even look at the high school students in Parkland, Florida, they were able to pressure the economic sector, companies like Walmart and Dick's Sporting Goods, within 2 weeks, something that had not been done. And they were able to change the political discussion. Why? Because they led with their personal stories. Right? So personal narrative and personal stories are highly transformational. I'm going to just skip over to a few other examples of how we've seen narratives that are interconnected to each other and how you may want to experiment with this. So the AIDS quilt. The AIDS quilt, in the 1980s, there was a denial that Ronald Reagan denied that AIDS existed entirely. And there was the denial actually got in the way of progress. which is exactly what we're dealing with right now. How were activists able to get around that? They were able to lead with their personal stories and to put their personal stories together in mass in a very symbolic way to say our loved ones are dying and we are going to grieve together and we are going to bring this symbol to the Capitol in order to be able to share a large message. And it was thanks to this kind of activism, things like the AIDS quilt and people literally taking over meetings of pharmaceutical companies that allowed for change to happen. And so how do we create environments where young people can tell both individual stories but collective stories that together can paint a different kind of vision of the future? Similarly, apartheid in South Africa, how did it end? It ended when musicians helped get involved and when we were able to show a different kind of image of what we could imagine for the future. Think about things like the pink triangle, right? The pink triangle and how it's a very fairly recent image and how that allows us to sort of identify what are safe spaces. And it's a use of symbols that allows for people to congregate around a shared idea. And so what are those symbols that we can create for this context? What are symbols that allow us to be interconnected and that even young people can create in order to show a sort of movement in one direction? I'm going to skip through some of this. So the takeaway here is that culture is a very powerful way to both move people's ideas and hearts, but also to lead to policy change. And as you all know, with the youth from the Sunrise movement, is that sometimes we need to tell the stories in a different way, because the same way that the stories have been told is actually not effective, right? And so it took people like Greta Thunberg to actually be disruptive and to say, hey, adults, we're going to do something creative here, and we're going to tell the story in a different way. We're actually going to change the narrative. Never before have we actually had the kind of pop culture moment with environmentalism that we do now. Why do we have this moment? Because Alejandro Ocasio-Cortez helped elevate something called the Green New Deal, right? The Green New Deal is simply a concept. Actually, most of us probably don't know all the workings of the Green New Deal, but the Green New Deal is a large cultural signifier that allows us to actually participate in a dialogue. And these are the kinds of things we have to imagine when we talk about environmentalism, is that CO2 is not an inspiring, it's not something that is going to inspire people. Neither is doom and gloom, neither are feelings of anxiety, but rather, how are we aligned with nature as a global community, especially in the United States? The United States is actually creating, we are largely responsible for climate chaos. The colonial forces who went and ravaged other countries and took their natural resources are responsible for climate change. And there's actually a concept called climate debt, which is how does the, quote, developed world actually put forth the solutions, because we used energy in such a disproportionate way. Why did we do that? Because it's all based around culture. There was a cultural idea that somehow we were entitled, that especially the Europeans, people with white skin, were entitled to more energy and to more resources, and therefore they could go steal and pillage and enslave and dominate and commit genocide, really, against other cultures in the name of progress, right? And so the same kind of thinking that it requires to commodify a human being, as we did in slavery, is the same kind of thinking that it takes to commodify Mother Earth. It's called the extractive economy. And what it is this idea that if we can extract and squeeze and just get everything out, we do it to animals as well. It's a way of thinking. And so these are cultural concepts. These are ingrained myths in how we are organized as societies, which is that we are entitled to energy no matter what. And rather than change the way we consume, we just go find energy somewhere else. And that's the thinking that has to shift. And the only way it's going to shift is through culture, is by creating another kind of culture. That's why I started with culture, is to help you understand that so much around climate change is not just in how we are aligned with a bigger purpose, but how we can actually change our behaviors and then inspire others to change their behaviors as well. I'm going to show you now some examples of how that's been done successfully. So number one is that aspirational narratives and narratives about the future are ways to inspire people. That in order to get people activated, not only do we have to name the problem, but we actually have to propose a different way of thinking. And so the current way of thinking, the global structure that is leading to climate change has many different problem ideas that we need to get rid of. One is that energy is endless, and that the earth is not an entity that has rights, and neither are animals, because the amount of animal agriculture that happens in this world. Did you know that animals for agriculture after humans are the most species, because we eat them. And so our system, our culture, culture is so much about food, but how did we get into a food system that is so detrimental? And what are ways that we can imagine something different? Well, we have to think about, how do we learn to appreciate and love the kind of stuff that comes out of the ground, right? How do you rekindle an awareness around that? And what kind of narratives, what kind of stories can we tell about pollinators and urban gardens that will inspire people to actually think about how to eat differently? And similarly, where is energy coming from? The other part of the aspect is that we actually don't get to see. We don't get to see the effects. We don't know where oil is being extracted from overwhelmingly communities of color. And most oil extraction sites in this state, and in the country actually, in the world, are in low-income communities of color where overwhelmingly kids of color get sick. And when you have things like Standing Rock, where indigenous people, that pipeline was supposed to go through a white community, and the white community said no, so they said, okay, we're going to take it through indigenous communities. And when indigenous people stood up, because that indigenous people are less than 5% of the global population, but they are 80% of the people fighting for the world's biodiversity. 80% are indigenous people who are proposing different kinds of forestry management, ocean management, and yet they are a community of people that we largely don't see in the culture around us. And so how do we transform that? And one way to do it is through telling stories that are aspirational. What is the kind of future that you want to see? What does realignment with nature look like? What does uplifting solutions by indigenous communities look like? In my case, one project that I did, Migration is Beautiful, I started doing this in 2012 when President Obama was deporting 1,000 immigrants a day. Immigration is such a classic example of how culture, these narratives around culture that immigrants don't belong, has actually led to criminalization and even to the violent separation of families. How is that acceptable? Well, it's because for almost 20 years, we have had narratives that we've used this word called illegal, that has actually dehumanized people and has now been so normalized that policy as follows. Climate is in the same kind, environmental practices are in the same kind of field, which is that we're working against embedded ideas that have been there so long that policies now follow. As I was driving, I was reading that Trump is undoing some of the coal legislation that Obama had put forth. So rather than say, no borders, or rather than say, don't deport us, don't separate us, don't criminalize us, I wanted to use an image called Migration is Beautiful, which is that we've been migrating since the beginning of time as human beings. Butterflies migrate, salmon migrates, every single living thing migrates. And that's the order of nature, right? And so how to use nature and its symbols to actually propose very simple yet effective concepts. And this symbol was tremendously popular, and it helped people actually see that part of what we want to propose is a different kind of story. We don't want to play in a narrative landscape that actually doesn't even deem us human. We want to propose a whole other idea and way of thinking. Similarly is how to create images that really talk about collective power. How can collective power is the solution to the environmental crisis is not through one person. It's not a hero's journey. It's a people's journey. It requires collective action and collective thinking. So I want to show you also how it's very critically to tie environmentalism with racial justice and actually with global justice. And so I'm going to tell you a quick little story before I wrap. So this is the community I grew up in, the Fruitville in East Oakland, and if you notice, we're sandwiched between two freeways, the 880 and the 580. So this is the Cal Enviro map, which many of you can see. I actually encourage every one of your students to check what is the emissions in their community and how does that connect to their zip code, right? In terms of where do they live and why would their neighborhood be a little bit more dirty than somebody else's neighborhood. Well, if you look at here, you see the red. My house is a little white dot. Why do you think there's red there and green at the top? Well, yes.
Oh no, I wasn't raising my hand. I was
okay. Why? Because the rich families, wealthy families who live along the 580 fought to make sure that trucks did not pass through their freeway. So there's no diesel trucks who go through there, but guess where they go through? They go through the 880 from the Oakland Airport to the Port of Oakland, and as a result, that entire corridor has very high rates of asthma. And West Oakland is even worse. In fact, West Oakland is considered a cancer alley. This is racialized land use policy, right? Why do poor communities have to live in the dirtiest communities? And this is not a one. This is Boyle Heights. This is East Los Angeles, and that's Compton. I mean, these rates are like in the 95% toxicity rates in California, where we have some of the most progressive laws. And this is Beverly Hills. So this is environmental racism, and this is pervasive. It's not just oil extraction, it's where animal agriculture is. Just try driving through the Central Valley, and you will see that many kids of color, especially Latino kids, have to be in communities where they're smelling cow manure, and all the dead parts of the cows are in there. So we can't, when we talk about climate change, oil doesn't extract itself. You know, the millions of cows that are slaughtered and that actually create methane gas, they don't just kill themselves. There's an entire, and they're not transported, they're not raised. There's an entire industry of people who have to work in those spaces who are exploited. They're not paid well, they're highly exploited. They live with a lot of PTSD and trauma, and they are often communities of color. And the oil extraction sites and these agricultural places are in poor communities, and so the problem is invisibilized. So we can't disconnect what's happening in science without an analysis on who it's actually most affecting and who are in the gears of this machine that we've created. And that requires a certain kind of storytelling. It actually requires us to elevate stories that we may not have heard from in the past, and to ask questions about where does energy come from? Where do you live? Why is your house next to an oil extraction site? Why do you have so much asthma in your community? Because if we were to say, for example, if we were to say in my neighborhood, hey, you know what, it's not fair that Black and Latino kids have to get so sick because the Port of Oakland is one of the largest transportation sites. Okay, well, how do we solve that? We shift to clean energy solutions. That's how we solve it. And that actually is good for the environment. What is good for oppressed and marginalized people is often what's good for the environment. And that is what we call intersectional organizing and intersectional storytelling, is that we are able to connect the dots. Because often environmentalism, especially the conservation movement, has actually just shown, it hasn't shown the root causes. It hasn't shown that the fact that the reason why we need to fight for wildlife and we need to fight for these spaces is because these spaces were stolen in the first place. And they were actually used in service of a very broken system that now is completely imploding on itself. So as you think about how to talk about these issues, get creative. You know, as an artist, that's how I always try to see, which is, what is the perspective that we are not seeing, and how do we say climate change is a racial justice issue? So I created this project called Climate Woke, because, you know, it's using some cool language that young people use today, but the thing is about how do we awaken to a new climate. Climate change is not even a good word. It's more like climate chaos, and actually Greta Thunberg said that. But how do we awaken and say, enough, we need to learn how to see the environment in a different way. And so I am at time, but I want to close with this, which is that this image, does anyone know how old this image is? This image is only 50 years old. It was actually taken in July 1969. So we are approaching the 50th anniversary of this image, which changed the way we think. Why? Because never before had we taken a photo of our home, of Earth. We had never seen it like this. And this actually created an entire movement of people saying, wow, we have to do something called Earth Day, which was born a year later, 1970. Earth Day helped trigger almost 25 pieces of environmental legislation, including the Safe Water Act. The EPA was created after Earth Day was launched. And now, unfortunately, a lot of those things are being undone. But I ask you, what is the next symbol? What is our next Earth 50 years later? What are the symbols and stories and images that are going to inspire people to actually take action and will inspire us to not just be informed, but actually change our behavior? And how do we build in practices? I think that the power of storytelling and the power of art and culture is that we move from just a place of intellectualism to a space of making. And when you use your hands and your brain, you're able to memorize, you change. You're able to imagine and to do a different kind of thing. And as you are designing your projects, really think about what are the ideas, what are the big frames that you want to change, and how are people doing things differently as a result, and questioning their behaviors, and ultimately having a global analysis, which is frankly a nature analysis, because nature has no borders, nature is highly interconnected, and as people we are interconnected species, and some have more responsibility than others to really address their impacts. So thank you very much. If you want to find me, you can find me on Instagram at Favianna1, and you can see some of my projects that I'm doing around environmental justice. Thank you so much. So, thank you, Favianna, for joining us. I think Favianna was such an exciting speaker that we're going to extend for 10 more minutes so that we can take questions from you all, and Eileen's going to lead that process. I want to point out that Favianna was quite modest in describing her work, and that she's actually a movement change maker, and the art that you saw up there is all art that she has created. She is actually the face of Ben & Jerry's Pecan Resistance. If you get that one, that's her art that's on there. And her migration project has become an international movement that she showed one quick picture of, but is actually a brilliant process that has people's stories embedded in their wings, and she took dreamers across the border and back. So the work she's doing is really deep and profound, and it's very much in fitting with what we're trying to get accomplished here. So thank you for joining us. Eileen's going to take questions.
Thank you so much for joining us today. What you don't know maybe is what we have been focusing on, and so before I take questions, I want everybody to put on their thinking caps, because you just gave me goosebumps when you were talking about the systems, about the system of impoverished communities, as well as the system of environmental pollution and that intersection. So just kind of be thinking about that before we take questions and answers. It's going to give about 30 seconds of thought. And this just shows me that you're thinking, and then when you have one idea, maybe you want to share 2 ideas so that we can make sure that everybody can have a voice. Okay, I think we're ready. So if you have a question, go ahead and raise a quiet hand. I'll wait till I see a few quiet hands up. I see a couple, another couple. Thank you for giving each other think time. Okay, go ahead. Do you want to call on one of the quiet hands? Go ahead.
So I teach in 7th grade, a pretty predominantly white, affluent community. And I'm wondering how I can expose those kids to suppressed narratives when they don't really, I don't know how to give them immediate access to those stories.
So if you Google things like environmental justice, environmental justice leaders of color. You will find a lot of examples of people whose stories you can share to your community. But I mean, I think actually even looking at the history of Marin and how it is, why it is that that is such a key place where nature has thrived, and ask the questions, who do you see here? Who are the people that can enjoy this? And who are the people who can't, and why? Because then you get into a discussion about public transportation. And that discussion is actually an environmental discussion, because public transportation is the future. The public transportation is what allows us to move in a collective way, and it's often very much done from an environmental perspective. So I would ask questions like that, and then I would highlight leaders who have actually proposed different ways of thinking around environmentalism. For example, Judy Berry talks about ecofeminism. I mean, the thing is, it's not just people of color, it's women. Women are highly marginalized in the climate change sector. You know who's at all of these global meetings? It's overwhelmingly men. And there is actually a whole movement now who is saying men have not done anything about the climate crisis, and they're actually at the head of all the major companies. So who are the women who are saying, who are breaking new ground? You can look at leaders in Standing Rock, right? Like the whole analysis, the whole use of the black snake, right? Which is at Standing Rock, which is where indigenous people were fighting so that an oil pipeline would not get built because it was going to affect the water. It was going to affect water, which that's why you would hear things like water is life. Highlight some of the leadership in that, and even think about what are the stories that we are seeing about oil, and who are the people who are standing up. If you look at even cases around the Amazon, or there was recently a big win for some of the indigenous communities fighting against some pipelines. I think if you show them, there's actually a few documentaries on oil and places in Africa and places throughout the Amazon on what oil companies have done, so that they have an understanding that historically the villains, you know, I'm gonna use storytelling language. The villains that have helped cause climate change. I mean, Enron, the Gulf, the fact that the oil spill in the Gulf and the impact it had on communities in Louisiana, right? That's another great example of environmental racism. You can also look at things like environmental racism, but I would say use stories as a starting point for discussion, and then have them maybe research how some of these heroic acts have happened, and then how can they make art in which they lift up this kind of leadership. Because then they are sort of doing something creative and understanding, okay, well, what inspired this leader? How did they tell the story differently? What did Greta Thunberg do differently that was actually disruptive and helps inspire people like her? Great, there was one over here.
Other people that had a question?
Okay, you got it? Okay. Over there?
So I work in a school that is entirely students of color, and with staff or teachers who are entirely white.
Wow.
And I think we've been wrestling with how to help our kids tell their story, and I would say find productive ways for them to identify the racism that they live in. I think that they don't really know how to name that as racism yet, and right. So I guess I'm not sure what my question is, but I would be interested in your reflections on how to help them do that work productively.
Yes. Okay. So they can do something called a cultural audit of your school or of your neighborhood, which is have them count 10 magazine covers, 10 billboards. Tell them to go to the movies and count how many actors are and what is their breakdown. How many of them are white? How many of them are black? What is the racial composition? And even they can even have them, just look at the images that are shown back to them. I was going to say, well, have them watch TV, but I'm not going to do that. Don't have them watch TV. Have them just do an analysis of the culture around them. Maybe they can even go to a bookshelf and in their library and do a cultural audit. How many women's voices do we see? How many black voices? Indigenous voices? And when they do that, they are going to see who's actually missing, and they can create a sort of pie chart. And then they can think about, so you move from recognizing the disparity to then thinking about creatively, what kind of story would you want to lift up and how would you solve this, right? So maybe a solution is that they host something around food, around people's cultural practices around food, and they talk about the meaning of certain kinds of food. Or maybe they talk about their parents' migration story. Often if they're kids of color, I can assure you a lot of them are probably first generation as well. What is their migration story? You could use the same thing I did, which is I used the butterfly, but there's so many creatures that migrate. How can you position them in a place of power so that while they recognize the disparities, they don't internalize them? And I think this is where things stop, is that it's very traumatic when you realize that you're invisible. And you can even have them say, who are your favorite characters? And you will see that there's actually not that many characters of color, besides maybe Dora the Explorer and maybe a few others, that inspire these kids. So maybe it's up to them to create a superhero. And what is their superpowers, right? Are they environmentalists? Are they helping solve inequality? But also you can do this even around gender. I mean, we haven't even talked about this, but you mentioned race, but there's also now a lot of kids who are not going to fall into the gender binary. And so there's a lot of creative ways of people to create their gender spectrum. How do they express themselves? How do we not name this male or female, but instead create a spectrum? So I would suggest activities that allow them to create a future of possibilities. It should be futuristic, it should be about the imagination, and how do they see themselves being in a joyful and powerful place, while they also get to celebrate some of their ancestral practices, right? Whether it's food, song, a sort of, like a show and tell where they can create even cultural artifacts or objects, and even with the reuse of them, you can get really creative around that. But I would just suggest that you both have a component that recognizes and analyzes. I mean, you can even do a quick science and math project, and then moves to a place of imagination and futurism so that they leave feeling empowered. Maybe we can take one from this side. Oh, there's none on this side. Okay, well, we'll take that one then. Yeah.
Well, first,
thank you. First of all, a comment, which is I really loved your migration is beautiful. That is a really great symbol. And I'm wondering if you have any suggestions of, and you kind of answered this already, but just of resources where we can go, just to find some great examples of, because a lot of this is hard to find,
Right.
Examples of people lifting up from some of these, more minority cultures, finding art, finding kind of roots action.
Yeah, actually, Rethinking Schools has a lot of great resources. Rethinking Schools has many, Rethinking Schools has books and posters and curriculums on social justice and racially inclusive education. I've actually done a bunch of stuff with them, so I would suggest them. I would suggest also, if you go to my website and you go under media and resources, I have the butterfly in black and white. I have videos to show the kids around migration is beautiful. There's activities actually even on food, on how you eat more vegetables. We know that climate change is both an issue of food, animal agriculture, and it's an issue of fossil fuels. But imagine, especially on the food, if you can get your youth to really understand nutrition and like how do you transition to a majority plant-based diet that won't have the kind of footprint that often different kinds of diets have. And imagine, you can do a project where they actually draw different vegetables and talk about how, if you don't eat like animals for one day, you save, I think, like 200 gallons of water just in one day. But that's where they can both, and then you can actually even make something to eat that's vegan or vegetarian. But that's an example of how you can take these concepts and then translate them into something that is doable while also analyzing. Rethinking Schools, though, is definitely a great resource. Great. Thank you so much, everyone.
Fabulous. Go ahead.
My website is favianna.com, which is with a V as in Victor and two N's. It's very easy. And there's also the video section and the resources section is there for you to use. You know what, I'll share it later. I do have a teacher discount for my art store because I have all these posters on my art store and I give teachers mass discounts on stuff.
We'll put the direct link to Favianna's website on the Padlet, and I will also, you got it already, and I'll also come up with a list for you of links of different heroes in the environmental justice movement that you can utilize in your